Good morning. Ordinary people choosing to follow an extraordinary God. This week and next week, we're just going to be talking about what it means to be an ordinary saint and unpacking Jesus' Sermon on the Mount or Sermon on the Plain, however you look at it, that we find actually in Luke's Gospel. Usually we see that sermon and we read about that sermon in Matthew's Gospel, but we're going to be taking a look at a couple parts of Luke's Gospel and what Jesus said there this week and next week. So talking about ordinary saints, what do you think of when you say the word saint? What do you think of when I say so-and-so's a saint or that's a saint? Is anybody? We're small enough, we're a crowd that we can have this discussion. So I'm going to allow for actual answers this morning. So what do you think about it? Shoot it, just say it out loud. Saint. When you think of saint. A person, a good person, what would you say? A person above. Oh, yeah. Person good, person above. What else? Miracles. Right. What else? Mother Teresa. Has she hasn't made sainthood quite yet, has she? She will. Yeah, we're like, yeah, she's going to make it. What else? Nobody's going to say a football team in New Orleans? Nobody's going there? All right. Well, you know, I grew up when I was a little kid. My grandmother used to take me to church when I'd stay at her house, and everybody would refer to my grandmother as a saint. And I always thought whenever I heard the word saint, I thought of my grandmother because everybody always said my grandmother was a saint. And I thought, well, maybe it was because she was married to my grandfather. I don't know why they said that, but I think they said that because she taught Sunday school for 50 years in the same church, second grade Sunday school for 50 years. So I think of that, you know, we say that is one of the saints of the church. I think yesterday we celebrated the life of Bob Callahan, and I think of that's somebody at Glenmar who was a saint to our church. And I think about these saints, and it's not that they'll ever become actual saints in the eyes of the Catholic Church, but they are ordinary saints. They are saints. They're people we would call saints. And I actually started to get curious about this. Do you know how do you become a saint? According to the Catholic Church and according to Wikipedia. Did you ever wonder about that? Well, I actually I went on there, and I'll try not to bore you. I'm going to go through this as quickly as possible, but these are the steps to sainthood. Now, the first step is that you have to die, okay? So the first step to being a saint, you have to be dead, okay? And you have to be dead, and you have to have died after. You have to wait 5 years. So you have to have been dead for 5 years before they actually begin an investigation into your life. So that's the next step. So you have to be dead, and then you get investigated. Your life gets investigated, and they look at all the stuff that you wrote and all the stuff that you said and everything you posted on Facebook and everything you put on your blog, and they look at all that stuff, and they do an investigation. And this is what's called the level of what's called the servant of God. What they're trying to determine is if you were a servant of God. And so they're putting all this information together. Interestingly, but prior to 1983, there was someone in the investigation called the devil's advocate. We use that word a lot, don't we, in our culture? This is where it comes from. They would assign a person to be the devil's advocate, to be the person who will make a case against your sainthood or a person's sainthood. And that was true up until 1983, but when they rewrote some of the laws in the church, they did away with the devil's advocate, so they're streamlining the sainthood process, okay, if you didn't know that. So that's what would happen, and so they would share all this information, and that would be handed off to another person assigned by a bishop who would be the postulate and called the postulate, and they would do further investigation. So if you made it to this level of called servant of God, the next thing they would do was they would exhume your body and examine your body to make sure that no cult had grown up around your grave or there were no cultic items within your casket, and so they would exhume the person's body. This is called non-cultist. So you move from being servant of God to the status of non-cultist. You with me so far? Because there's some more steps. So you've moved from servant of God, they've done the investigation, now they've investigated your remains and you're non-cultist. The next thing they do is they hand all this information, all this investigation to the Pope. This goes to the Vatican. The Pope looks at all this information, and then it's the Pope's job to work with a group of people to determine whether or not you were heroic in virtue, is what it's called. So that's the next stage, to be heroic in virtue. Not like standard, not like C+ in virtue, not B in virtue, but heroic in virtue, meaning that you were a person that was above and beyond in these virtues. The virtues were faith, hope, charity, prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. So if you were not just ordinary, but heroic in those virtues in your life, throughout your life, then you would be at that status of heroic in virtue. So, you're still not a saint. The next step is to become venerable. Now, venerable is the place where if you get this far, it still needs to be proven that you made it into heaven. Okay? So, you're not necessarily proved that you're in heaven. So to prove that, then prayer cards are created in your name and your image, and people begin to venerate and begin to pray and intercede. You intercede and go to you for intercession as a venerable person in the church to see if a miracle occurs in that prayer. And if a miracle occurs, then that is proof that you're in heaven. So that's proof that you're interceding. You're in the presence of God, and so because you're in the presence of God, that's why the miracle occurred. So you're venerable, and if that miracle occurs, then you move to being blessed. I think, is that where Mother Teresa is today? I don't know. I haven't been following. But she's somewhere in this process, okay? So then that would be blessed. A miracle has occurred. Then they have to determine whether or not you were a martyr or a confessor saint. So this is a distinction. If you died for your faith and you were martyred, then you were a martyr saint. And some of our, like St. Matthew, St. Peter, those are martyrs of the faith. They were martyr saints. Then there are confessor saints. Confessor saints are those people who live their lives given to the faith, and they lived in such a way that they didn't die for their faith, but they basically gave their whole life to following God and Christ. So they become a confessor saint. So you're still, at this point, you're a blessed status. When a second miracle occurs through prayer and intercession and veneration, then you get the status of saint. And then you become an official saint of the church. Buildings can be built in your name, and so forth and so forth. So, how many people here would like to become a saint? Now, let's get it straight. You have to die. You have to not have been worshipped. You have to be extraordinarily virtuous. That rules me out. At least 2 times miraculous, and you have to definitely be in heaven. So that's a lot, right? It's a lot to go through to become a saint. And this is the streamlined process, since 1983. I think about my grandmother, I would still say she was a saint. I think about Bob Callahan, I say that man was a saint, right? Because a saint is a person who just is willing to set themselves aside for God's purposes, who are willing to set their lives aside for what God wants to do. We become a saint, I think, when we do that. I think Jesus in this sermon is actually saying everybody can be a saint. And yet at the same time, Jesus is also saying, here's what it means to be a saint. If we went by Jesus' definition, Jesus would actually agree that we need to be heroic in virtue, but Jesus is not saying all these other virtues. Jesus is actually saying we need to be heroic in the way we love. Jesus says we have to be so heroic in the way we love that we even need to love our enemies. That's heroic, isn't it? I mean, it's ordinary to love your friends or your family, and we have a hard time sometimes even loving those people. But Jesus is saying, I want you guys to even love your enemies. I want you to love the people who don't love you. I want you to love the people who hate you. I want you to love the people that will slap you across the face, take your clothes, and all these other awful things, and I want you to love them. That's heroic love. That's extraordinary love. And that's the thing, is that ordinary saints actually exemplify this extraordinary love. Now, I want to make a note here because I know someone will I might get an email about this. Jesus is not saying that we're supposed to allow ourselves to be abused. Jesus is not saying that we're supposed to be doormats. Jesus is not saying that we should just put up with an abusive relationship or abusive situation in our lives. That's not what's going on here. when Paul was out preaching the gospel, you think he ever got slapped across the face? Yeah. There were times he was beaten, he was stoned. Now, Paul didn't stay in that situation. He left town. He got out of that situation. You see, he wasn't going to say, I'm going to just keep going back in there and getting beaten up. No. He actually left. He went to the other place. And there were times that the Spirit led him not to go to a place because he knew he would be beaten or abused. And so it wasn't as though Jesus is saying, put yourself in harm's way. That's not the point. Jesus may actually be using a rabbinical form of teaching, which is overstating the point, which is saying our love is supposed to be different than the rest of the world's love, that our love is supposed to be heroic. And we're even supposed to love those who don't love us. That's heroic love. So if we take it literally, we would say, oh, well, I'm supposed to just put up with abuse. But I don't think we're supposed to take it like that. See, we don't stop loving others because we've been hurt. We don't stop loving others because we've been hurt. See, Paul didn't stop preaching the gospel because he got beat up once. He kept preaching the gospel. He just didn't go back to the same place. You see what I'm saying? He kept doing what God was calling him to do despite the fact he could have quit, right? He could have said, every time I go out there in some places, I get beat, out of me. I'm not doing this anymore, God. But he doesn't do that. He says, I'm going to keep preaching the gospel. I'm going to preach God's love even if people don't like it. He was being heroic in loving others. So we don't stop loving others just because we get hit setbacks or things happen. When I was on I almost want to say 2 decades ago. Now I know I'm old because I'm talking in decades. But 2 decades ago, I was on a trip to Hartford, Connecticut. We were working for Habitat for Humanity. We were gutting an apartment building. I don't know if I've told this story before, but we're gutting an apartment building, and this is a lot of fun. If you've never gutted an apartment building, it's a great way to get out some of that frustration. So we're tearing stuff apart. We're gutting this apartment. It's the first day on the job. We're throwing stuff out the window. We're having a good time, throwing stuff out in the dumpsters and tearing stuff out. And I'm up there, and it's a summer day, and the place is open, and I hear this yelling out on the streets. This man is yelling at some of our team members, some of our workers. And so I look out the window, and here is this man. He is out there, and he is just berating our team and just telling them, get out of my neighborhood. We don't want you people in my neighborhood. Get out of here. You don't belong here. Blah, 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 blah. And so I thought to myself, maybe I ought to go down there and check it out. So I walk down there into the street, and he's getting in. And one of our other members are already trying to have a discussion with him, and I'm walking in, and he's yelling and screaming how disrespectful we are to come into his neighborhood. You see, what was going on was we were all white people, and we were in an African-American neighborhood, and he felt like we were judging him. He felt like we were disrespecting him as a community leader, and that we didn't need to be there, and that he didn't want us there because he said we were making him look bad. And I understood some of the dynamics there. So there's a couple reactions, a couple responses we could have had at that point, right? We could have said, well, we got a right to be here. Who made you the mayor of this town? We could have said, we got a right to be here as much as you have the right to be here. This isn't your property. We could have stood up for ourselves. We could have set up some rights, called upon the law, had the police come and take them away, right? That's one response we could have had. Or we could have let him have some of his own medicine, give it right back to him, But we didn't do either of those things. We spent an hour talking to him and listening to him and understanding, what was going on, why he was upset. And we just kept saying, we're not here to do that. We're not trying to make you look bad. We're not trying to do it. We're just trying to help. That's all we said. We just kept saying, we're just here to help. We just feel like we're here to help. We just want to help. God has sent us here. We feel God's a part of this, and we're just here to help, and we just want to work with your community. And it took a couple days. He would come and check on us every day. But by the end of the week, an enemy had become a friend. Because we chose not to demand our way, even though he was demanding his way. We chose not to say we were right and he was wrong, even though he was choosing to say he was right and we were wrong. You see that? And so an enemy became a friend because we chose a path of love rather than I'm going to be right. I'm going to get even. I'm going to make sure I get my thing, or I'm in charge. So that's what changed. And so that's what I think Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying, when we love others and we respond in love, that does something. That says something about the kingdom and the God that we follow and the God that we serve. And see, that's the other point, is that ordinary saints reflect an extraordinary God. Their hope is not to get people to like them or people to love them. They want people to like God. They want people to love God. And so they have to exemplify God's love to others. They are attempting to do that. Jesus said that when we love like this, when we love extraordinarily, when we love heroically, Jesus said, you will be children of the Most High. That you're identifying yourself with God. You and I are identifying ourselves with God's love. And how did God love us? Did God love us with like a C+ kind of love? Or a B+ kind of love? No, God was heroic in the way God loved us. And so for us to be followers of God, followers of Christ, Christ says, you have to love the same way. Was Jesus slapped and spit upon? Was Jesus' garments taken from him? Well, you know, he lived this out, what he preached. He lived what he preached. He said, God is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. How are we supposed to be kind to the ungrateful and wicked? Jesus died for us while we were yet sinners. You know, God didn't wait for us to get our act together. God loved us anyway. Paul said that we even defined that us sinners group, not just me, that us as a group of sinners, we were enemies of God. And God loved us. And so that's the whole, we reflect God. We show God when we are ordinarily loving other people. You know, I was thinking, I'm running out of good stories. So I went to the folks that went to Haiti and the folks that went to Slidell, and I said, can you send me some stories? And it was kind of late in the week this week, but actually I got I got like a whole pack of stories. Emails of stuff that happened on our Haiti trip and happened on Yom trips, and I actually, I've heard some of these different things, and I had one story and I just changed it. And here's the cool thing, when I asked that, some of the Haiti folks have said, where did you see ordinary saints on your trip or see that? And what came back to me was the kids that we worked with were the ordinary saints. The people that we ministered to were the ordinary saints. They taught us. And that's what I love about some of that work, is that we learn more than we go in there, we think, oh, we're going to go in there and we're going to change the world. And then we get in there and God changes us. Those people, the people that we work with, these kids they worked with, changed them. But I want to tell you one story that actually happened this past trip for our Yom trip, Youth on a Mission. Does everybody here know how Youth on a Mission got started? I know that I've heard stories, but are you aware how that? I didn't think so. There are people that don't know this story. Hurricane Katrina happened in 2005. Not long after, a group of youth from Glenmar went on the first mission trip to Slidell, Louisiana, to do hurricane relief for Katrina. There were two young women who, after touring the site of the Katrina disaster, said they couldn't get out of the van. They couldn't get out of this van. They just were so overwhelmed by what they had seen that they just were like, I can't do it. There's nothing. What can we do about this? There was that just kind of overwhelming feeling. And one of the leaders there said to them, you have to get out of the van. You need to get out of the van. Not only do you need to get out of the van, you need to go home and tell people what's going on here and the need here. And so at the end, sometime during that week, these two young ladies, I think another young woman and some others, and it kind of grew to about 6, sat down and they put together a plan to come back the next year. So our youth developed a plan to come back and to help this. And they have been doing this every year. I think Paul, is that right, 2 trips a year now, winter and spring. And so these groups go out, we commission them, we pray for them. And I was saying, we always send you guys out, what's happening? I'm always wanting to say, what's going on? And so they sent me some of these stories. And so that's how it got started. So this past trip, they had been working, both the winter trip and the spring trip. We had 2 trips already this year down there. They had been working with one homeowner. This particular homeowner was a nurse at the hospital in New Orleans. The day she tells the story of the day when the floodwaters came to her house. She said she could see the waters coming towards her house, and so she went back into her house to get some of her things because she was thinking, I'm going to be needed at the hospital. She was a nurse. And so she went back into her house to gather some things, especially her shoes that she wore when she was nursing, her nursing shoes. She wanted to make sure she got those. She said she got into the house, the water was up to her ankles or knees. She waited in the house, she was getting her things together, it had gone up to her waist. By the time she got all her things and was leaving the house, it was up to her chest. And she left. She never made it to the hospital in New Orleans because the hospital closed down. In fact, she lost her job. So she's now homeless and jobless. This was 2005. What year is it now? 2012. So almost 7 years. September will be 7 years. She will be moving back into her home because of the work our team did in a few weeks. In a few weeks. 7 years waiting for her home. Now, that's just half the story. When I heard about this, it turns out that she had actually tried to have her house rebuilt prior to this. She had been ripped off by contractors, which has been common practice down there. So she has it. So that's why part of why it's taken this long. But she was so thankful to have her house rebuilt. So the team, our young people, invited her to dinner on Thursday night. Said, "Why don't you come and have dinner with us? We're going to have dinner. We want to have dinner, and we're going to worship after our dinner. We want to invite you to come be with us." She says, "Well, I'll come to dinner, but I'm not staying for worship." And so the youth said, "Okay, that's fine. So just come for dinner." And so she came for dinner. And as she interacted with our youth, she changed her mind. She says, "I think I'm going to stay for worship." And so at this time, she had been living with her 80-year-old mother. So it was her and her 80-year-old mother. They came, they had dinner, they worshiped, they had communion with our team, they sang with our team, they heard the stories that the team shared. And her 80-year-old mother said to one of the leaders or the youth, I don't know who, doesn't matter, on the way out, she said, "This is the first time my daughter's been to church since Katrina." Think about that. Now, did the kids do anything? Did the kids do anything saint-worthy? Would they make it to sainthood? No. They were just being themselves. They were just being ordinary saints. They were just loving like they naturally know how to love. And because of that, a life was changed. And that's what ordinary saints do. That's what ordinary saints do. They just are glad to see somebody's life impacted, just glad to see somebody's life change. And they pointed somebody else to an extraordinary God. That there is a God who's still in charge, who's still working things out, who's still working through people. I want to ask one last question. What keeps us from loving that way? What keeps us from just loving extraordinarily? What stops us? We'll talk about this a little bit more next week, but there's a verse later in Luke in the sermon, in verse 45, Jesus says this, the good person out of the good, actually I'm going to read it in a different version, sorry. It says, good people bring good things out of the good stored up in their heart, and evil people bring evil things out of the evil stored up in their heart. For out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. See, this is a key point in the whole sermon for Jesus. He's saying good people bring good things out of the good, and here's the phrase, stored up in their heart. So the question is, I think that it's about what we are storing up in our heart. You know, it's about what we store in here. I don't know if you've ever done this, but have you ever kept a file on somebody mentally? You said, I'm going to remember that hurt. And I'm going to file it away in my heart. I'm just going to store it there. And then the next time the person does something, you know what? I'm putting that thing in their file too. And I'm going to store that in my heart. And then they do something else. And what do? We get that file out that we got on them with their name on it, and we file another thing in there, and we store it where? In our spirit, in our heart. And then, one day, when the file's full enough, we whip it out on them. Don't we? We just lay it out on the desk. Jesus said, whatever you store in your heart, that's what comes out of you. Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 13, love keeps no record of wrongs. Love doesn't do that. Love doesn't file stuff away. Love burns the file. And so if we're not going to store that in our hearts, what Jesus is saying, what we need to store in our hearts is something else. We ought to have a file of God's love. And that every time God does something awesome, God does something loving in our lives, we ought to have a God file in our hearts. And we put that in the God file so that what we're storing in our hearts is God's love. Does that make sense? That's part of how we begin to love others and exemplify God's love to others when we store God's love within us. That's how we'll learn to love. That's how we love. Our church's vision is to be a people that are rooted in the life-giving message of Jesus Christ. It's found in Ephesians chapter 3, which talks about that we be rooted and established in God's love. That we would know how deep and how wide and how long and how great God's love is for us. And that we ought to sink our roots down deep into that love. Basically, we ought to file away God's love and store up God's love in our hearts. And when we do that, we'll be ordinary, maybe even extraordinary saints of God.